To keep this show going, we need your help. Support independent activist news by visiting our Patreon page and becoming a patron of Act Out so that we can keep acting out on the front lines. Visit patreon.com/actout, and without further ado. This week, as the nonstop election coverage continues, the biggest player in the game has yet to get any airtime at all. Next up, a special extended interview with lawyer and historian Jeff Clements, whose latest project pushes to fulfill the American promise, as yet unrealized and currently chained down by a corrupt corporatocracy, a mirage democracy. But first, two parties diverged. Two parties diverged on a stage, and I chose the one that was all the rage, or the one with the best eyes, the brazen Sieg Heil, the promises soaked in old lies, the one that my friends, my parents, my neighbors told me was best, or not as bad, accepting that every one of us had chosen an evil, just a lesser one, hopefully. But the lessers stacked up to quite a tall mound. Now this mountain of evil is no less profound than the one on the other side. And through this blind faith we couldn't see, as they slyly stretched out a smile, knowing that you, that I, wouldn't look further, wouldn't bother to find, that the divergent parties converge. In the end, see, you're seeing double, but there's only one. Drunk off the bile, the potent and vile, state-sponsored pile of toxic sludge shit, I admit. It's really so tempting and sometimes convincing that one of them could be the one, like Matrix and Neo, the one that we need, the one that can save us from all of this shit that we're in, this mess that the other guys made, and now we must come to the aid, swallow our pride, quiet the fringe minds that cry for a greater good, not a lesser evil, but people, please, we know it's not perfect, but isn't it worth it? To avoid a psychopath crowned by crowning our own and hoping they hold on to the lines that they sold to us in the hopes that we'd keep this mold. Will you do as you're told? Go to the polls, shut down your conscience, convince your mind and your soul that this one is better. Don't think of their record, don't dig into what they have done. Just trust all the pundits who say that this is it. You have to toe this here line. For the sake of your future, your life, we can't let them win. But who is them? The parties diverged on that stage, and from this pit look up and see. The puppet masters are pulling strings, corporate shills are waiting in wings, folk devils made to highlight dumb things, and in the two spotlights, there's no room for you, for me. And scream as you might, no one up high hears your plight. The echo chambers are sealed, loops fed to out-of-touch goons that master the craft of a populist glow for the plebes down below, who hold on to hope that this one will do right by us, or that this time, no, really this time it's different. The definition of insanity has to have crossed your mind. How many times will you do the same thing and expect it to work? How much more dirt will you throw on that pile of evil now stretching higher, and their false solutions, a bold resolution to hold on to wealth while we writhe under these capitalist spires, when they say that we can't yet, the money's not there, be patient, I swear. Watch where their other hand slights out of frame. Shuffle, arrange, foundations and tax havens, arm deals and land steals. This is why you don't have the right to choose, and you won't have the right to your rights. The simple things that could make up a good life, a living wage, healthcare and schools that don't feed to a cage, pipelines give way to sun, wind, and hay, maybe less money shuffled backstage, but main stage is managed by well-oiled fiends who want you to shut up, believe that the parties diverged embody the herds of people they both disdain. It's a shame that we look with blinders at two evil minders and think that's all we can do, when what we must do to be saved is to fucking wake up. And that's not poetic, but it needed to be said that we are killing ourselves. The lights of that stage blot out our rage, keep us a placated mass. And as the years pass, a requiem mass for what we could have done if we would have forged a new path, gotten our collective heads out of our ass, and chosen a road less traveled. Two parties diverged on a stage. Will you buy in? Will you play? Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. So, the elections. As that way over corporatized and propagandized day draws closer, the Moneybags pile higher. In fact, as of May 16th, Open Secrets reported that the total amount spent on the election so far is a nice plump $1.253 billion. And economists project that the 2016 presidential election will rack up a bill of at least $5 billion, more than double the amount spent just 4 years ago. Hillary Clinton alone will spend more than half of that if she goes all the way to November. And speaking of which, let's take a look at the money bags of the two Democratic nominees, since we're here. Now, these numbers are from late April, and they're also from the New York Times. Why do I bother saying that? Well, the New York Times editorial board came out in January with an official endorsement of Hillary Clinton. And again, I'm pointing that out because all of the news that's fit to print has more than a slightly skewed view of the presidential election. And if they wanted to soften anybody's image, it would be Hillary's. So, with that in mind, let's take a look. By late April, Hillary was ahead by about $76.8 million, with a near tie on direct donations to the campaign, meaning money that hasn't passed through a super PAC or dark money channel. Candidate raised basically includes anything from the phone calls asking you to pitch in $5 to a small table at an event, the max being $2,700 a person, supposedly. So this near tie is pretty impressive, not just because of a strong media bias towards Clinton, but because the majority of Clinton's candidate contributions have come from people giving that max, namely the $2,700 allowed. In comparison, Sanders gets the majority of his donations from people giving way below the max amount allowed. So that's a brief overview of the candidate contributions directly, but if they're tied, where's that extra $76 million coming from? Well, it's almost exactly the amount of money that Clinton has raised from super PACs. In comparison, Sanders has been incredibly vocal about his refusal to use super PACs in his campaign at all. And that's not to say that Sanders doesn't have any skeletons in his closet, because he does. Everybody does. Or that I'm taking this opportunity to throw my weight behind Sanders because I think there's some shit that need some answers there. And I'm not going to tell you who I'm voting for, because that's not the story. But I do want to give him props for his pointed campaign to call out the corrupting influence of money in politics. Sure, he's not the first person to notice that we live in a corporatocracy, but he is the first presidential candidate to build his platform on that foundation. And as a result, he's changed the way that many people look at campaign finance and how we view our role as citizens in these billion-dollar fiascos that we call elections. But regardless of what happens in July at the DNC, or indeed in November, what is our role? What can we do? What must we do to overthrow this oligarchic, plutocratic kleptocracy? Because as many of you know, you can't just show up every 2 to 4 years, give a shit, and then go back to not caring. If you don't want to live in a corporate dictatorship, you have to pay attention all the time, because these guys feed off of your inattention like gremlins after midnight. And for those of you under the age of 30 who have no idea what the fuck I'm talking about, Google that reference. Gremlins and 80s trivia aside, I want to introduce you to our guest for this week, a man who works to answer those questions that I just posed, and has an idea that could dig us out of this corrupt quagmire and restore power to the people through the tried and true avenue of amendments. Jeff Clements is the co-founder and chair of Free Speech for People, an organization and campaign pushing to overturn Citizens United. He's the author of Corporations Are Not People, Reclaiming Democracy from Big Money and Global Corporations. He served as Assistant Attorney General in Massachusetts, where he led more than 100 staff in the enforcement of environmental, healthcare, financial services, civil rights, antitrust, and consumer protection laws. And in 2012, he founded Whaleback Partners LLC, which provides cost-effective capital to farmers and businesses engaged in local, sustainable agriculture. So all of that is pretty fucking cool. But on top of that, his latest project is called American Promise. And instead of me describing it to you, I'm just going to go ahead and let Jeff take care of that one. Take a look. American Promise. Describe what it is and how it differs from what you already have with Free Speech for People.
So American Promise, Eleanor, came out of my travels around the country, my work these past 5 years. As you know, there's a lot of really good work being done by a lot of good people including free speech for people and many other groups. There were some missing pieces, though, I found. I'd go to communities around the country. People would respond well to the call for the 28th Amendment. Americans generally agree about the problem of concentrated money and corporate power taking over our democracy. But I never felt like I had an adequate answer to the question of what can we do here in our town? How can I help? People want to help. And so, and then sometimes there'd be questions about, well, which amendment and which group and so forth. And so American Promise is intended not to answer all of those questions, but to provide infrastructure and network and connection for Americans to develop those answers together. So American Promise is about a place where we can kind of answer the call for all of us to our responsibility to step up and take action together. It isn't about dictating what the only one and true answer can be.
So on that same level as, the answering the call as citizens, in the video for the American Promise, Doris Kearns Goodwin says, "We were citizens in the 60s." And that struck me as, obviously, as somebody who wasn't around in the 60s. And, I mean, in your experience and in your travels and in your work, what do you see as, what are we today? Are we citizens? What's the difference?
Well, at our best, we're citizens, but citizenship is hard, and it calls us to do things that aren't about us, but about the future, about other people, about the country, and so I think we are now, I would say, in a test of citizenship, and will we answer that call or not is the question. I think that's what Doris meant by we were citizens in the 60s. We were citizens at the turn of the last century. And people stepped up to win constitutional amendments so women could vote, to win constitutional amendments so that we could overrule the Supreme Court when they struck down the progressive income tax, many other things. And I think now it's an open question. I think the risk is when we're not citizens, we're consumers. We just think that, as President Bush said after 9/11, go shopping was the call to action, and shopping isn't a call to action. It's maybe like other things, a distraction from the challenge and the pain of the situation we have to deal with. Citizenship is about looking it in the eye and dealing with it.
So I want to talk about what you said in the video as well, because you were talking about the amendment and saying that we're actually overdue if you look at history. But now that the system is so clogged with corporate influence, what is that effect on the amendment process, and is there a correlation between that and the corruption that was at the time of the passage of the 17th Amendment dictating the direct vote of senators?
Yeah, I think there is a direct connection. We can learn from the past of when amendments were successful. They are never easy. I mean, almost by definition, amendments are a response to constitutional crisis. And none of them are easy because they're always going up against the entrenched, powerful forces that created the constitutional crisis in the first place. So the 17th Amendment, which you mentioned, Eleanor, is the one that enabled us to elect senators. We, the people, cast a ballot now for U.S. senators. That did not used to be the case. The 17th Amendment was essentially necessary to stop the oil companies, the coal companies, the big, at the time, the sort of big industrial food, as we call it now, the cattle companies, from essentially buying their senators. And so that wasn't easy to get unelected, corrupted senators, by the way, all of whom were male, and also had to vote for the 19th Amendment to have women get the right to vote. They didn't do it because they wanted to. They did it because the amendment process creates an overwhelming demand, because you don't win amendments 51-49. The only way to get them is to build kind of an irresistible force of consensus in the country, 75, 80%, that just can't be stopped even by the corrupted system that it is trying to fix.
So speaking of this issue of people just being appointed and not voted in, the issue of the Supreme Court appointees, because you yourself are a lawyer, and so I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, because a lot of people are saying that oh, well, you just have to vote for Hillary, even if you don't like her, because of this issue with the Supreme Court. And then, of course, you mentioned in the video again that the Supreme Court can be overruled with an amendment. So how do you feel about the argument that the Supreme Court justices are the most important issue on the ballot?
It's every issue on the ballot is complicated. Justices do matter. I won't pretend that they don't. But I think it's a mistake to, think someone else is going to save us, whether it's a president, whether it's a Supreme Court justice. We are way past that. So, if we get a 5-4 court going the other way, how long does that last until it goes 5-4 the other way? How much opportunity do we lose by, going into the divisive electoral system in the hopes that someone else will save us, rather than building power together as Americans to save ourselves and then have a Supreme Court and a president that actually is representative of the people? I think that's the better strategy. And frankly, there's history that proves it. So some of those amendments, we talk about women getting the right to vote. The Supreme Court decided women don't have the right to vote. And it took about 40 years for the 19th Amendment to overturn that decision. Now, you could say, oh, that shows amendments take a long time. Well, sometimes they do. But bear in mind that in that same period, 25 Supreme Court justices came and went on the Supreme Court. So if you bet on the Supreme Court to fix their mistake of robbing, half of the Americans of a right to vote, it would have been a bad bet. We might still be waiting for women to have the right to vote if we said, well, let's just elect the right president and they'll appoint a court. And because people said that. People said, oh, the Supreme Court will do it. So, I think people should vote for the presidential candidate they think is the right one for them. And I think they should work for the 28th Amendment and get this constitutional crisis solved by us. And, frankly, remind the Supreme Court, it would be the 9th time that we overturned a Supreme Court decision, that it's really about we the people, not a 5-4 vote on the court.
So talk a little bit about the movement to create an amendment and how amendments have been passed in historically, and also how you see what do you think the best path to passing an amendment is at this point?
Yeah, so historically, there have been sort of waves of amendments, and I think that's the first thing to remember, is that they come at times like ours, where there's just a lot of related systemic failure, economic, environmental, you name it, social challenge. There's just a lot of kind of breakdown of what was working for a while. And you saw that. The first 10 amendments were the Bill of Rights after the American Revolution. The next were after the Supreme Court decided the Dred Scott decision that African Americans literally have no rights. They can't be citizens, according to the court. And we plunged into civil war, but we also got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The turn of the century in the Progressive Era, 4 more amendments all at once. The 1960s, 4 amendments all at once. So I think that's the first thing to bear in mind, is amendments can help organize and create and magnify rapidly growing social movements that will succeed with the amendment. But they don't happen in Congress with a lobbying effort alone. They happen mostly in cities and towns and states across the country. And that's what we can learn now, is and this has been working. There's been 700 local resolutions passed, many by ballot initiatives, by wide margins, calling for the 28th Amendment to overturn Citizens United. There have been statewide ballot initiatives, and that helps drive up support in Congress. And I think that's the tried and true method. Back to the Revolutionary era, they did the same thing. And the reason, I think, is because it starts conversations in communities where people live and are experiencing the problem and experiencing the personal nature of when you're talking about fundamental constitutional rights. And it's powerful to discover that your neighbors, your people in your community, people you thought you didn't agree with, are of the same mind and are rising to this sort of higher calling. And I think that's what we can do now across the country. It's what American Promise is designed to do, to help support and then connect these local networks where people can act and advance initiatives that they think are right. It's not top down, but then they're organized, supported, and and linked together in a connected network. And that can accelerate the way all amendments have done and we can do now, which is essentially build that national consensus and then drive it into actual political power that results in the 2/3 vote in Congress that we'll need and ratification in 38 states that we'll need.
So I do want to ask you about the election, but before we get to that, I wanted to ask you in this hierarchy of law, because right now we're looking at the TPP, and which would create these, or have already created these international trade tribunals, for example, that would allow a company like Monsanto to sue for loss of profit. How would that be impacted by the 28th Amendment? And if TPP were to pass before the 28th Amendment, would the 28th Amendment be able to pass with something like the TPP in place?
Yeah, it's another great question, Eleanor. I think, the thing about TPP and the global trade, and I hesitate to even call it trade, it's so much beyond trade now and really creating a kind of global corporate governance in which people aren't represented. And that is something that is both a real problem because even constitutional amendments can be trumped by a global treaty because of the supremacy clause of the Constitution. If we have a treaty of the nation where essentially our sovereignty, our choices have been agreed to have been given up to a global body, then that rule applies until we change the law and pull out of the treaty. And that gets me to what the 28th Amendment could do to help. The 28th Amendment doesn't change any of those treaties. What it would change, I think, is I have a very hard time believing that in an effective democracy where money dominated decision-making and corporate lobbyists aren't writing the laws for us, but we are, that we would come up with those same kind of trade deals. I think we'd still have global trade, which can be a very good thing. But I think the American people actually would cut pretty good deals with other human beings on the planet to have, a fairer, more equitable, more healthy, more sustainable kind of interaction among nations. And so, the 28th Amendment, again, I don't want to say it's going to bring, everything that we need and everything we don't like. But it is necessary to begin to work on all the other things.
Right. So it's basically it's like a tool. It's like if you have a hammer, it doesn't mean that you also have a house. You still have to use it to build a house, but you have a tool in which to do it, basically.
Yeah, and I'd say it's a little more than a tool because there are a lot of tools that can build a house. In some ways, I think of it as the foundation of the house. If we don't have the foundation, we can start building the house, but it's going to fall down. Governing ourselves as the constitutional principles that are our foundation, that can actually support a lot of good policy on top of it. But if we're trying to build the house on top of a foundation, we're literally, this is what the Supreme Court says now, we're not equal citizens, that money actually does trump. That's the law of the land. The corporations do have rights. That's the law of the land that trump the rights of people. If that's the foundation we try to build the other stuff on, it will come down.
So I do want to talk about the election and specifically about super PACs and dark money. So this election is slated to be the most expensive in history, about $5 billion worth. How does this translate in terms of policy? And do you think that a politician who gets a lot of super PAC money can be held accountable to the people, or is that impossible in this current system without a 28th Amendment?
The real problem in the democracy is the presidential level is a big problem, but it permeates local, state, all federal elections, and that is much less visible. And I'll just give some examples. They're not super PACs, but they're dark money entities. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is one. And then I'll just be cross-partisan, the Democratic Governors Association and the Republican Governors Association. Those are two front groups for tons of corporate money. In the last several election cycles, about $700 million in mostly corporate money going through those into state elections that have made the difference in states, in U.S. senators, in governors' races, in how we district now because of state houses. So the whole gerrymandering, that is where the money really makes a difference. I think we can just ask ourselves, if it were illegal to spend $100 million, as Sheldon Adelson is planning to do, through a super PAC, if it were illegal even to give, say, $5,000 to a candidate, and that almost all the money came from people like all of us giving, $25, $10, $50 to candidates of our choice, who do we think would be in the lead? I don't think we would see the same kind of outcomes.
Yeah. So final question, and sort of, philosophical question. The American Promise, that name carries a lot of weight. And so I was curious, as a historian and a lawyer, do you feel that we've ever achieved the American Promise? And if we haven't, whose fault is that? Or why haven't we?
Yeah. And have we ever achieved it? No. This is a forward-looking movement. This is a forward-looking organization. And that's what the country is, I think. I mean, the same people that decided that equal human beings will govern ourselves and wrote up a document that talked about the pursuit of happiness in governing together. I mean, it sounds like a wonderful commune. They held slaves, and women didn't vote, and you had to own property. So, I know the history is anything but a promise for a lot of people. But in looking forward, what they unleashed, whether they meant to or not, was actually a real promise, a real dream that we will actually live together peacefully, equally as citizens and govern ourselves. And that is the promise that American Promise is named after. And I think it's the promise that drives every generation. And, Martin Luther King said that the dream that he had was a dream rooted in the American dream. He talked about a promise unfulfilled. And that's what this is. It's a promise unfulfilled, but that means that now we own that. If we don't fulfill it, we'll be the ones to blame.
For more information on American Promise, check out americanpromise.net. And for more info on Jeff, his book, and projects, visit corporationsarenotpeople.com. And that, revolutionaries, does it for this week's show. Thank you so much for watching. Please do spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. As usual, check out the last slide to see the sites that I mentioned in this week's show. And be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. From the fittingly hot as hell Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.